Welcome to the overview of Chapter 16, Chapter 18 in the book, looking at economic policy. I'm Mr. Rodman. Thank you for joining me. So let's take a look at this economic policy as we round out this Unit 4 on American political ideologies and beliefs. We start by looking at the United States as a mixed market economy, meaning that we have a freedom from government regulation, freedom in terms of allowing the market to make decisions about what to produce, who to produce it for, and how to produce it. But government steps in when it comes to regulating safety, to keep people safe, regulating the safety of products, food that's made that is safe for people to eat, products that are safe for people to drive, for people to operate. And all of these are really where we see government step in from a safety and protection point of view. Otherwise, we very much have a free market economy in that the market is really taking the lead in terms of driving those decisions about who to make products for and what products to make and how they're going to make them. In other societies that aren't mixed market economies or free market economies, the government makes those decisions. In more of a command economy, you see that the government is actually choosing what is being produced and for whom it's being produced and how it's being produced. We don't see that here in the U.S. economy. It is mixed market in that the only time government's stepping in is really to regulate for safety and protection of individuals and others. So that's what we see here in terms of a market economy. Now, the government steps in two roles in terms of helping the economy, helping get money moving and getting people to spend. 70% of our economy comes from consumption. That is consumers going out and spending, buying things, goods and services. And so we see that the government can take an economically active role in one of two aspects: fiscal policy. That's the taxing and spending, and also monetary policy. And that's where the Fed regulates how much money is actually in the market. They do that using kind of a water faucet, if you will. You turn up the water faucet really high if you want a lot of water to come out, a lot of money to come out, and you turn the faucet down and tighten it up if you don't want as much money coming out. And that's a really good way to approach it. And we'll talk a little bit later about more of the monetary role that is being played there. So this is fiscal policy, budgets. Think a budgetary policy. That's Congress and the president that are playing that role. And then monetary policy, which is the Fed, which is trying to be removed from politics for the purpose of being able to make decisions based on economic data, based on what's good for the economy, not necessarily what's popular for getting reelected. And that's the biggest difference. Now, the economy goes in cycles. We call this a business cycle. And the idea behind it is that there are times in which we are doing really well. We are in an expansionary period. We're in recovery. We are growing. We are hiring. We're opening new factories. We're creating new jobs. And that's a really good time to be in. We just left that in 2020. That was almost an 11-year period of expansion and growth coming out of the Great Recession of 2009. We peaked and then we headed into recession with COVID, with coronavirus. We saw the unemployment rising. We saw GDP falling, and we'll talk about what those are in just a second. But the significance here is that it impacted the economy negatively, and that led us to recession. We don't know. We've reached the peak until we're already falling, just like a roller coaster. And then we go into recession, and we need government to step in to bring us out of that recession. The longer that we stay there in recession, the more it becomes a trough. That can become a depression era type of part of the business cycle. So obviously we don't want to stay there if we get there. We want to turn that ship around and get moving back into recovery, back into expansion. So why is it that the government has spent not one, not two, but three stimulus package bills on fiscal policy in addressing, from Congress and the president, in addressing this coronavirus because of the recession, is really to try and get us back on that road to recovery. And that's really what they're trying to do with all of that money that they're putting out there. So fiscal policy is a great way to make that happen. And again, we'll talk a little bit later about that as well. So keep in mind, a couple of things to keep in mind here. We want to talk about GDP. We want to talk about inflation and unemployment. So let's talk about GDP for a second first. This is the idea of the gross domestic product. You see it kind of labeled right here. GDP, the gross domestic product, in terms of what you see here. This is the total dollar value of all final goods and services that are produced in a country from sea to shining sea, anywhere within the borders, within a given year. And this is a calendar year, so January 1st to December 31st, regardless of the government's calendar year for their fiscal budget of being October 1st through September 30th. This GDP is gauged on a calendar year. They're looking at it in terms of what is quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, and so on. So how much are we actually producing in goods and services? The total dollar value of those goods and services that are being produced, how are we doing that within a given year? If we are growing and producing more, then our GDP is in expansion, in recovery. It's really moving forward. Businesses are hiring. They're opening new locations. They're opening new factories, new plants. And people are finding jobs that they didn't find before. These are good times. That's very much recovery. If businesses are closing, if businesses are laying off workers, this is what we could tend to see as a recessionary period. And if we have 2 quarters of negative growth in GDP, in terms of we're not producing more than we were before, 2 quarters of negative growth back to back, that would be a recession. That is how we define a recession today. So if there are 2 quarters of negative growth, that's what a recession would be. And then obviously you get too far down there, you've got depression-like circumstances. You don't want to play around with that, which is why you don't want to get to the depression and you want to turn it around as quickly as you can. So that's why Congress and the president have really been, in both administrations, have really been focused on trying to spend their way out of this to try and get money in the hands of people so they can go out and help grow the economy by buying things, buying goods and services, paying for the services that they're getting, such as rent, car payments, food, clothing, that kind of thing, and all trying to grow the economy out of that recessionary period. And we've had 3 quarters of negative growth, so we're definitely in recession. And waiting on the latest economic data from the first quarter of 2021, January, February, and March. But the concern is that the hope is that we've turned that corner and are looking at a potential recovery, but we don't know what that data looks like just yet. Some of the data looks good, some of the data not so good. So we'll see how that shakes out. Now, in terms of GDP, our GDP is roughly about $21 trillion with a T, trillion dollars. Our overall debt is about $28 trillion. So our debt to GDP ratio a little off there, and a lot of that coming from a good $5 trillion coming from all of these coronavirus stimulus packages that we've seen. So that is significant in terms of the amount of money that's been spent to try to get us out of recession, to try to get us back on track. And that is obviously of concern in terms of what the government's trying to do from a fiscal perspective. Again, spending and taxing to try and grow the economy. And we can see it here in terms of GDP. We can see that we look at all this wonderful growth that we have over. This is 9 years, but if you go back looking at the end of 2009 and into 2010, you'd see that a very strong recovery in terms of, look at that, 2015, very strong recovery there. Even 2012, some really good numbers in terms of comeback. And then we can see it's very tepid at the beginning of 2020, and then coronavirus is worrying people, and then coronavirus hits the United States, and then the economy, because so much of it is closing, the GDP just tanks, all right? Factories are shutting down. People are sending people home to work. Many factories going on a very cyclical, a smaller scale in terms of how many days they're open a week. This is all leading to a large, significant cut in GDP that's happening here. So we can see GDP falling off, and there's your 3 quarters of negative growth that is leading to these concerns that we see in the recession that we have now. You can see it in a dip here, but this is longer term, looking over the last 70 years at what GDP has done. You can see some of the dips, and the gray rectangles are leading to recessions during those periods. And you can see the 2008-2009 one that I mentioned, what they called the Great Recession, was significant here in that it was prolonged. You could see the dip, but you can see this dip is larger. Now, there is some comeback from that that we're seeing in terms of leveling off. But the idea is the economy will grow, it will come back, and there will be more growth to it. We are very resilient in that regard, and you can see that from post-World War II all the way up to 2020. We have survived a lot of recessions along the way, and you can also see that those recessions have been about every 10 years, usually 7 to 9 in terms of what's happening there. But the idea is that we come back, and we come back better than ever, and our GDP continues to grow. How can we measure that growth? Well, GDP is one way we look at that. The other two I mentioned, inflation and unemployment. So inflation is when prices rise. You're paying more for that loaf of bread. You're paying more for that gallon of milk or that gallon of gas. And that costs you more out of your pocket. You're paying more for that, and you're not getting paid anymore in terms of your wages, but you're paying more out of your pocket, which means it's costing you more money of what limited resources, paycheck that you have. And so those inflationary pressures can cause economic damage as well when you don't see a lot of growth in wages, and you see prices rising. That is a concern that could also lead to recession. It can also lead to problems and fears that people have. They stop spending. That lack of spending actually leads to greater problems down the road for the economy and that growth that we were talking about. And then the last one is unemployment. And this is the idea of measuring how many people are looking for work who can't find it. And that is obviously problematic. Right now we have about 10 million people out of work that are looking for jobs that can't find them. Now, some people have left the workforce. They've said, hey, I'm going to take some time off. I'm going to spend it with the kids. I'll take care of the kids, and I'll look for a job in 6 months or something like that. And so they've left the workforce. They're discouraged workers, but they're not counted in the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate could actually be higher than it is because those workers are no longer looking for jobs. And that isn't counted in the unemployment rate, which kind of tends to buoy or bump up the unemployment, the overall employment numbers, and make unemployment look better than sometimes it actually is. So that is a concern as well that economists look at. Inflation rate, as we mentioned, not as much of a problem for us here and now. We saw in the in the 70s into the 80s, we had a lot of problems with inflation. If there's one thing that the Fed and that Congress and the president have been able to do, it's find ways to encourage growth without encouraging inflation. Even in the 90s, when you think about some of the inflationary pressures we had last, were in the 90s, and through fiscal and monetary policy, through economic policies that the government was able to implement, they actually kept inflation from rising too badly. You can see in the 90s here, inflation actually drops going into the late 90s into 2000, even though it was a tech boom that was huge in terms of growth and unemployment really, really low, GDP rising through the roof, and the idea here is people were worried about inflation, but they stepped in to keep that inflation down by using some policies we'll talk about here in a moment, and that really did help. It really did help to keep inflation at bay. So we've gotten better at this. We definitely are better at it than we were, 50 years ago in dealing with it back in the 70s. We're much better at dealing with inflation now, and almost to the point that people are like, inflation isn't really a worry for us anymore. I wouldn't ever go so far as to say that, knock on wood. But the idea is some economists are just write it off. They're not even worried about inflation because their focus is more on GDP and unemployment, which is what we see here. Now, notice in 2020 with coronavirus, that unemployment shot up as as people were unemployed, almost 15% unemployed in terms of factories closing down and laying off workers, businesses closing in which people weren't coming in to shop, so there's no reason to keep the doors open or keep the lights on or keep the workers there. So unemployment shot up, but we can see that that has moderated since then, and it is now down to about 6.5%, somewhere around in there. So that is significant in terms of changes that have been made there. Now, why are we so worried about inflation? Or why did we used to be? Because of what we call stagflation. This is the idea that we have stagnant wages. Wages don't change, but inflation means prices are rising. So I'm paying more out of my pocket for goods, and I'm not getting paid anymore for the job that I'm doing, but I am seeing prices rising, and I'm paying more for that loaf of bread. I'm paying more for that produce that I'm buying at the store. And all of those things are leading to stagflation. That is concerning because it does lead consumers to buy less than what they normally would, and obviously that can impact GDP, that can impact the hiring process in terms of encouraging that growth that we were talking about earlier. And so that is a major concern. Now, we measure inflation by looking at what we call the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and that's basically where we go shopping. We put in a basket all of the goods that we're going to buy each month, and we go back each month to buy the same goods. The government does this every month, and it basically charts how much is a gallon of milk, how much is a dozen eggs, how much is a gallon of gas, or a loaf of bread. And they look at this and they measure this, and they've done this every month for decades now. And you can actually look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, data that the government has on these items that I mentioned, because they buy them every month, they track them, and have been since probably the 30s and 40s, since the Great Depression, on a lot of these items. And they use this to measure whether inflation is rising or whether it's not concerning. And we see it is less concerning than, like I said, we saw in the 1970s, but it is still a measure of our economic health. If inflation rises too quickly, that's a concern that prices are rising, wages can't keep up, and so people are going to stop spending, which is going to impact GDP, which is going to lead to higher unemployment, which could lead to a recession. And then we're back in the boat we were talking about before. So that's why the government tracks all of this information and all of this data, and really trying to keep the economy healthy by monitoring these types of tools. Now, Congress and the president use what we call fiscal policy to address these needs, these concerns of the economy, and they do it by looking at taxing and spending. Fiscal policy is all about budgeting, and budgeting includes, do we tax citizens in order to get revenue, or do we spend money on citizens in order to encourage them to go out and spend money in the economy, and that encourages growth too. They're usually going to do some combination of these, spending and taxing, in order to make this happen. What's important about this is by having more spending and cutting taxes, it encourages growth. By cutting back on those spending measures and increasing taxes, it's actually going to discourage growth. So if you're worried about inflation in a really hot economy, you're going to raise taxes, you're going to cut spending, and that is going to limit how much spending is actually going on, and hopefully reduce the inflationary pressures. Now, it's important to note that the government spends about a third of our GDP in terms of the spending that is going on, and that is significant because it does have a significant effect. Think of it like a ripple effect, what we call a multiplier effect, in terms of when they spend a dollar, it's not just a dollar that's out there, but a dollar times many. What we call a multiple, that then it could be $3 that's actually spent in the economy as a result of that $1. So one person spends a dollar, and then that person has the dollar, they can go out and spend it, and then they give it to another person who spends that dollar, and you can see how this progresses, and it encourages a lot of spending and a lot of growth that we see there. So in looking at fiscal policy then, how do we grow the economy? Well, we increase government spending and we cut taxes. That is going to put more money in the pocket of consumers and businesses, and it's going to encourage the businesses to expand, to grow, to open new locations, to open new factories, new buildings, to invest in those resources, including hiring more workers to help them in those efforts. And that's going to help grow the economy. It creates jobs, it helps create more GDP, and it gets the economy back on track. And that really is what the government is trying to do right now to grow that economy. They're cutting taxes, they're increasing spending, they're encouraging people to go out and spend money, they're helping to pay for those $1,400 checks that went out, or helping to people to pay the rent and pay their bills, all of that helping to grow the economy. Now, if the economy gets too hot, we move from the left side over to the right side of this graphic in order to slow the economy down. So if we're worried about inflationary pressure, then we're going to slow the economy down, and we do this by doing the opposite of what we did over on the left side. So now we're going to raise taxes, we're going to cut government spending, and that's going to take money out of the pockets of consumers. It's going to take money out of the pockets of business owners. So they're going to be less likely to splurge on that, on taking out a new mortgage, or buying a new location, a new building, or hiring additional workers. So it's going to encourage them, it's going to discourage them from spending lots of money, and really to think twice about doing so, and hopefully slow the economy down, keep it from getting overheated. Because when it gets overheated, that's when we have to worry about inflation. So think grow the economy, increase government spending, cut taxes, or slow the economy, we're going to increase taxes, cut government spending. And that is how we use fiscal policy, that taxing and spending, to grow and slow the economy in terms of what's there. Now, in terms of what revenue is brought in through taxes, we can see 50% of it comes in through individual income taxes. 86% comes in through income taxes and payroll taxes, what employers pay for workers in terms of their payroll taxes. And so we can see that's significantly where the money comes from today, is from businesses and individual workers paying these income taxes. Before the 16th Amendment, we didn't have an income tax. So the money had to come from other places. When the 16th Amendment passed, income taxes all of a sudden became the overarching and the biggest source of revenue. Corporate income taxes, as you can see, is about 7%. That rate today is about 21% on corporations, and many of them use tax exemptions, as you've seen in the news probably recently, to get their rates down even lower than that. Some of them pay no corporate income taxes because of exemptions that they can claim and have claimed in this in this pandemic. But we're talking about $3.5 trillion in revenue that's brought in. Now, we spend a lot more than that, so you can do the math and figure that that we have extra in terms of what we owe, not in terms of what we have in revenue, and that's called a deficit. That means we've paid out more than we're bringing in revenue, and that means somebody is going to have to pay for that somewhere along the line. We're going to have to borrow the money in order to pay for it, and we'll talk about how we do that in a second. So a lot of this coming from individual income taxes and those payroll taxes, as I mentioned. And this is a look at the Trump budget back in FY 2020. You can see this is just discretionary spending. We talked in the last chapter in social welfare policy about non-discretionary, the Social Security, Medicare, interest on the debt. This is just discretionary spending. About $1.3 trillion. And you can see over 50% of it is really on defense, military readiness, that sort of thing. And that is in line with what we see Republican presidents, conservative presidents have traditionally done. When you look at Gerald Ford or Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, even George Herbert Walker Bush's father, very much focused on defense spending in terms of what we saw there. And that spending and taxing is really what drives that fiscal policy. So if you're going to bring in revenue, you're going to bring it in through taxes. If you're going to spend, it's going to be spent through those budget programs, that fiscal policy. Now, the types of taxes that are brought in are mainly progressive in terms of what we see from the national government that is being paid out. So progressive taxes, the easiest way to remember it is the more you make, the more they take. And that's what I always tell students. The more you make, the more they take. That's progressive. Higher incomes pay higher percentages of taxes. Lower incomes pay lower percentages in terms of their overall income. And that's the way the structure is designed. And so the tax system we have is traditionally that. Now, we also have regressive taxes. We see this in terms of it's a particular percentage of what you're paying, and so it may be the same rate across the board in terms of everybody has a particular tax, and as a result of what you're paying on this item, it may be more expensive to buy that product. That's going to hit the lower income people a lot harder. If you're buying a product, you're going into a store and you're paying for it, and you're paying a tax on it. People said for a long time, state sales taxes, the sales taxes on cigarettes is a good example of a regressive tax because people are going in and buying them. Can be individuals, if they're poorer, that's a regressive tax in that it's going to cost them more than it would cost other people that had higher incomes are paying and the higher income group is paying less in terms of their overall proportion of their income in buying these products and paying these taxes. So regressive taxes are more a tax on the poor, and we see that with state sales taxes in particular. The last one I mentioned here, we do not have, but Herman Cain made it famous in a presidential race many years ago, and it was called the 999 plan, and it was basically a flat tax. Everybody pays the same rate, whether you're high income, low income, or somewhere in between. Everybody pays 9%, the 999 plan. It didn't get a whole lot of traction, but that is a great way to explain the flat tax, or everybody pays that same percentage. And those are essentially the taxes that we see that are out there today. Now, as I mentioned, we run a deficit each year. A deficit is how much money we have to borrow in order to pay for all of the expenses that we've had over the course of a year. That deficit is an annual deficit. Okay, so what you're seeing on the right there are all of the deficits through the years, going back to 2005 all the way up to 2016, and they contribute. Then they take that $474 billion from 2016, and they add it to the national debt. The national debt is the overall bill of what we owe to creditors, to investors of our debt. And that number is a staggering $28 trillion with a T, trillion. I mentioned GDP was about 21 trillion. The national debt is about 28 trillion. And that deficit just in last year alone, because of those stimulus bills, was about $3.7 trillion. Now, I look at the slides that I made 10 years ago related to this, going back to some of the data from 2010 and 2011, and the overall national debt back then was about 13 trillion. So that can tell you how much we've spent in the last 10 years, in just 10 years, in terms of what we see there. So pretty significant in terms of the changes that have been made. We've also had some wars, the war in Afghanistan, the war on terror, the war in Iraq. Those are significant in that they add a lot to the debt as well in terms of money that's being spent there. Above and beyond military readiness. You can go to the usdebtclock.org. It's a great example of where you can see this actual debt clock live. You can see here it was about 28.1 trillion when I froze this slide in order to put it in this slide deck. But the idea is the debt continues to rise because we continue to spend more money than we're bringing in tax revenue. So, cutting taxes is a very popular method, and people love it when their taxes are cut. But the problem is, if government doesn't cut back on spending, somebody's going to have to bridge the gap by borrowing money in order to pay for that. So the Treasury has to go out and conduct sales of bonds or treasuries, securities, if you will, in order to bridge that gap. Because just to say, hey, we're going to spend X amount of dollars, if you don't have X amount of dollars, somebody's going to have to pay for it somewhere along the line. And that is significant in that we have had a deficit from year to year, which continues to contribute to this national debt. And so what that does is that becomes a part of, again, we have to pay the interest on that debt. And you can see here that in terms of debt to GDP ratio, what's the difference here? 130% in terms of what the GDP is, about 21 trillion, and what the national debt is, 28 trillion. But the importance here is that you got to pay the interest on that debt, and so the interest alone is significant. I think the last slide said it was about $224,000 per taxpayer in terms of what we owe. But just paying the interest on the debt is something that is non-discretionary. You can't. It's not an option. And as you can see here, it is about almost $400 billion. 400 billion with a B, $400 billion that we are spending just paying for the interest on the debt, on the money that we have borrowed to continue running up this debt. So, and that's significant, $400 billion on the national debt that's there. So that isn't including any new debt that we take on, including this stimulus package, the 2.2 trillion that we saw that was approved by Congress and signed by the president a couple weeks ago, and that continues to rise. You can see how significant a rise that has taken in terms of total public debt that is seen there. So, what do we got to do? Well, we've either got to cut back on spending or we've got to raise taxes, right? We've either got to, and we can't cut back on mandatory spending because we owe it to Social Security and Medicare. So 62% is mandatory spending. You can't cut it. You can't do anything with it. Discretionary, we looked at in the Trump budget, is about 30%. And then that net interest on the debt, about 8%. And actually, with all of these stimulus packages, it's actually about 12% now. So it probably is over that $400 billion, probably closer to 500 in terms of what we see there. You may remember from the last chapter, mandatory spending, things you have to spend money on. Discretionary, you get to decide. Congress and the president get to decide. And that is an area that continues to shrink. And the reason is because mandatory spending continues to grow, and the net interest on the debt continues to grow. And as long as you're growing those programs and they cost more money, that means there's only so many pieces in the pie, and that is going to eat into discretionary spending. Even when we cut taxes, tax revenue, tax expenditures is what we call them. This idea of you're losing tax revenue because you've given some type of benefit or tax cut out there. Somebody's got to pay for that. That is a plan that again has been factored into budgets, and so if you're going to cut taxes in that area, you got to figure out, well, then how are we going to pay for the programs that we were using that money to spend on? So that creates an even wider gap, and you can see the problem that we're talking about in terms of the problems that we have there. Who handles the budget for the president? Remember, it is the OMB. It's the Office of Management and Budget. They oversee that. Congress has their own looking at the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, and so a lot of times when the president turns in the budget, which they normally do, usually in February or March of each year, the president will propose a budget, and Congress many times will gut it and start over in a lot of cases. Sometimes they'll use what the president suggests. But many times they will just go with what they want to do in terms of what they want to pass and see if the president will sign it. And they'll work with the White House and on budgets here and there. But sometimes, especially if there's divided government, you will see Congress say, "Mr. President, your budget is dead on arrival. It is DOA." And we saw that. With the Trump budget, we saw that with the Obama budget during the Republican when the Republican majority in Congress. So when there's divided government, you're going to have a lot more budget negotiations needed because it's going to be harder to pass those bills. What is the budget process in terms of making that happen? The president, as I mentioned, submits the budget to Congress. Congress can take it or leave it. Many times they will work through it in terms of suggestions, but they're going to do their own thing. They're going to refer it to committees and subcommittees that will handle this in terms of appropriations bills. How do we appropriate certain dollars and monies for programs? And then the House and Senate will work out those details. Remember, if you're going to adjust taxes in any way, shape, or form, it's got to be the Ways and Means Committee in the House that starts that budget process. So the House Ways and Means Committee usually will start that process in terms of in terms of proposing any type of legislation that the House would take on. And then once the House and Senate both pass the same identical bill, it would go to the president for signature or veto, and then hopefully that process is short and sweet, and the bill becomes law. But as we know, many times that's not always the case. That doesn't always happen. So it can be a long and drawn out process. Again, the president proposes that budget in February or March. They will work all year on that in trying to get it done by September 30th because the new fiscal year starts on October 1st. If they don't have a new budget by October 1st and they haven't approved a short-term measure to keep the government funding running, they will experience what we call a government shutdown. And that is where the government runs out of money to pay for the next year's budget. And so federal employees are basically furloughed. They're sent home. And they don't know whether they'll get paid, and they don't know what will happen. It's a really ugly time. We've seen some pretty bad government shutdowns in recent years related to problems that the president and Congress were having in terms of trying to find areas to negotiate, and that can be very taxing, very very challenging in that regard. So that is essentially the budget process, the fiscal policy aspects we were talking about there. Now, obviously, there are all kinds of politics around this. And who did you put in charge of fiscal policy but politicians? Citizens want more. They want government to do more, but they don't want to pay for it, right? I mean, that's everybody, right? We want more for less, and we want more out of the money that we're spending, and we don't want to spend as much money, right? And politicians love to get reelected. They love to promise things and deliver, but they know that costs money in order to do so. But nobody likes to go out there and say, hey, I'm going to raise your taxes and please reelect me. Who does that? Nobody is going to work on that. And that's why it's a really tough challenge to try and get people to support fiscal policy changes such as cutting spending and increasing taxes. And that's why we don't see a lot of it. That's why we also run deficits from year to year, because no side wants to say no to individuals that they're going out and seeing on the campaign trail. And therein lies the crux, because it really is hard to balance a budget. And Congress has tried since 1985 when they called for these automatic cuts, what we call sequestration. If you can't agree on a budget, we'll start doing a sequester. We will start with automatic across the board cuts to everything in the budget in order to get to that balanced budget. Well, guess what? It didn't work. And Congress tried for 5 long years. They tried this, and even they, in that time period, even when they passed this bill, they couldn't make it work. And so ultimately, they would eventually give up in trying this. And they do, always talk a good game in trying to balance the budget and saying we need to return to a balanced budget. But both sides are guilty in this regard. Both Democrats and Republicans are guilty of the spend model. And whether you tax more or you tax less, spending is involved. If you're going to tax less, then you should be spending less. Otherwise, you've got problems in terms of deficits and having to borrow to pay for all of that. So we continue to see time and again that fiscal policy is a real challenge to many in Congress. And running for office in trying to do so. There is a fun game here that I would encourage you to play. It's called the Fiscal Ship. If you go to fiscalship.org, you can find it. It's a really neat game. And what it does is it allows you to be Congress and to try and come up with a budget that is balanced, that is effectively serving the people. And it's not easy. It is not easy at all in order to try and address that. So do check that out. It's a fun game, and you'll like it. Let's shift gears now and talk about the Fed as we go to the second half of economic policy here, looking at monetary policy. The Fed, or otherwise known as the Federal Reserve, is the Federal Reserve Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and they're the ones that basically control the money supply. They are nominated by the president, they are confirmed by the Senate, and that's really the only political role that they play. So the president will appoint them, the Congress will approve them, the Senate in particular, and then they really take a step back from politics. They really try not to get involved in political back and forth. They want to look at the data, and many of these people are really policy wonks. They're not politicians. They're not people who work up on Capitol Hill. They're people who like to crunch numbers and analyze data, economic data, and look at the GDP and unemployment and inflation that we talked about before to see how the economy really is doing and whether the government needs to improve, turn on the water faucet and improve the money supply, or whether the Fed needs to cut back on that water supply and turn down the faucet, turn down the flow of money so that there isn't as much out there in terms of what is in the marketplace. And obviously in recessionary times, they want to turn up the money supply, and that's what they've done over the last year, really tried to encourage more money out in the market, turned up the faucet, if you will, and really trying to get the economy moving again. And we'll look at how they do that here in just a second. The Fed can't be fired without cause. The president cannot fire them. The president, as I mentioned, appoints them, and they serve staggered terms, but they're usually longer than a president's 4-year term. And so the idea is they have a lot of independence in terms of what they're what they're up to, because they're trying to not be political. They're trying to be focused on the economic data. And how they do this is they look at the different regions, and there are presidents that serve in each of these regions. So we are in Region 5, which is based in Richmond, Virginia. There is a Baltimore branch that covers Maryland that is a part of Region 5, but it is the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond that our state is a part of. And what they do is they look at economic data in our state, in our region, in our urban areas, and then they report that information usually 8 to 10 times a year back to Washington. And before COVID, they used to fly into Washington for a Federal Reserve meeting, as you saw in this picture that you see here. They're all sitting around the table for what we call an open market committee meeting, a Federal Open Market Committee meeting, FOMC, and they basically talk about all the data that they've gathered from their regions. So they report out what's happening in Region 12, Region 8, Region 9, Region 2, and they report out what's going on in terms of GDP, what's going on in terms of inflation and unemployment, and what's happening there. And with this, they try and determine, well, should we turn up the faucet? Should we open the money supply so more money is out there? Or should we tighten it? Should we turn it down so that not as much money is out there? And that really is the role that the Fed plays. It's all about manipulating the money supply. So they can do this in a number of ways, what we call the BIRD strategy, B-I-R-D, and they can do this by using some tools in their toolbox. The BIRD toolbox is essentially made up of B for bonds, I for interest rates, R for reserve requirements, and D for discount rates. And the Fed can use these 4 tools to essentially adjust or manipulate the amount of money that's out in the market. So by bonds, the Fed is going to buy bonds to grow the economy. So buy to grow, sell to slow. They're going to buy bonds to grow the economy. So what they're doing is they're saying, hey, there are bonds out there that people are holding, treasuries, securities, whatever you want to call them, T-bills, and the Fed's going to buy those and give people cash for them. They're hoping that the people will take the cash then and go out and spend it in the economy. They'll go out and spend it, which will encourage businesses to grow. Just like we talked about with that fiscal policy, monetary policy is looking at how can we grow the money supply? Well, we can put more money into the money supply by buying those bonds, giving money to the people that were holding those bonds. Now we have the bonds, we as the government, the consumers have the cash, and they're going to go out and spend it in the economy. It's going to encourage businesses to hire more people, open more businesses, and hopefully get us on the road to recovery. Okay. Also, with interest rates, this is this is the rate, what we call the federal funds rate. An interest rate is a rate that the Fed can allow a bank to charge, no less than. They can charge more, but not less. And the Fed is going to lower that rate if they want to grow the economy. And that is going to encourage more investment. If you have an opportunity to get a lower rate on a home mortgage or on a new car loan or on a college loan, you're going to take it. You're going to be more likely to take it if it's a lower interest loan. So that's going to encourage growth in the economy as well. The next one is reserve requirements, and this is the idea of what a bank has to have on hand in its vault in order to keep its doors open. And this is since the bank runs of the 1930s. We saw the stock market crash of 1929. The Great Depression led to a lot of bank runs in which banks didn't have enough money on hand to meet their depositors' demands. And as a result, they closed their doors and many of them never reopened, which meant the people that held those deposits, because those banks weren't insured, they lost everything. And the Fed wanted to make sure that the government wanted to make sure that never happened again. So Congress passed the Securities Act of 1933 and 1934, and that basically called for reserve requirements that said, hey, if a bank's going to stay open, they have to have a certain amount of money on hand all the time in their vault, so that if somebody comes in and says, I want to get X amount of dollars out, I can get money out of there and still have faith in the bank that the rest of my money is there. That's the reserve requirement. And so the Fed's going to lower that requirement in order to grow the economy, because if a bank has a lower reserve requirement as opposed to a higher one, they're going to be more likely to loan out money to businesses, to consumers, and whatnot. And so lowering that rate also helps grow the economy. Lastly, the last one is the discount rate. The discount rate is what a bank can borrow from the Fed or from another bank in order to meet that reserve requirement. Okay, each night at midnight, a bank has to account for its reserve requirements. It has to meet that reserve requirement. And sometimes the bank needs to borrow money in order to meet that, because they made too many loans today. And so we don't have enough money in the vault to meet our reserve requirement. So they can borrow money from the Fed, they can borrow money from another bank, and what they pay is a discount rate. Now, that discount rate right now is so low that it is actually the same as the interest rate in the I in Bird. But the idea here is the Fed can lower that rate in order to grow the economy. It encourages banks, again, to loan out more money. So by lowering rates, we're growing the economy. By raising those rates, we're slowing the economy down. And these are the tools that the Fed has in their toolbox in terms of growing and slowing the economy. Just like the Congress and the president have the power of taxing and spending, the Fed has the power of monetary policy to buy and sell bonds, to lower and raise interest rates, to lower and raise reserve requirements, and to lower and raise discount rates, all in an effort to keep the money supply stable. To either grow the economy and get us back into recovery, or to slow the economy down and keep inflation from rising and hurting the economy overall. So that federal funds rate is what I was talking about there in terms of the target rate. It's about 0.25% right now in terms of what the banks can charge no lower than, and they can always charge higher, but they just can't lower. So by lowering those rates, it increases the money supply and it encourages economic growth. If they're going to raise those rates, that's going to lower the money supply, and it's going to lead to a contraction of that economic growth. It's going to slow the economy down. So buy to grow, sell to slow, lower rates to grow the economy, raise rates to slow the economy down. So why does this matter? Because if you have too much money out there, and there's too much money in the economy, and you're worried about inflation when recovery hits, then you may have a problem in the economy growing too quickly, and inflation will start to rise. As inflation starts to rise, people see the rising costs and they get scared, and they hold on to their dollars instead of spending them. And that discourages growth by business, which leads to layoffs, which leads to closing doors, and a ripple effect in a negative manner that can lead to recession all over again. So that's why they have to be very careful about how much money is out there in the money supply, because they want to encourage the growth, not discourage it. And they want to make sure that they can keep it at a steady pace, not let it get out of control. Likewise, if the economy is growing too slowly, we want to turn up the faucet. We want to buy bonds. We want to lower rates. We want to encourage people to go out there and spend money, put money in their pockets by increasing the money supply and turning up the faucet. That's going to encourage growth, and it's going to encourage people to go out and spend money in the economy all over again. And that really is the driver there. Okay, and the idea here is, again, with interest rates, they're going to lower them to grow the economy. They're going to raise those rates to slow the economy down. So these are the tools that we see in the money supply. And there's more details here in the slides, so I'd encourage you to check them out. In terms of here's the reserve requirements and kind of an explainer on how that takes place. Again, lowering the reserve requirement to grow the economy, raising the reserve requirement to slow the economy down. Same thing is true of the discount rate. In order to meet that overnight reserve requirement, they're going to lower that rate to grow the economy, raise the rate to slow the economy down. And then the last one, as we talked about, buy to grow, sell to slow on those bonds, treasuries, T-bills, securities, government bonds, whatever you want to call them. But you're going to buy those bonds to grow the economy. That puts money in the hands of consumers' pockets. It encourages them to go out and spend money and encourages growth in the economy. And that essentially is what leads us to the bird of monetary policy. Now, in terms of these Fed rate moves, you can see the Fed does a lot of them in planned meetings. I mentioned 8 to 10 times a year they come about with these plans. But you can also see some unplanned cuts that they took in order to try and help grow the economy. They lowered the rates faster than the meetings that they were planning to hold. And the reason for that is because they were worried about the data they were seeing. They were worried that the economy was needing a little extra help, and before we were going to meet, we need to lower those rates. So they get together on conference calls and Zoom calls or whatever, and basically lower those rates. So this is what we've seen over the last 15 years in terms of some of those rate cuts in those interest rates. And whenever you see federal funds rate, that's what they're referring to, are those interest rates there. Okay, now I want to shift gears and talk for a second just about a couple of economic perspectives and how this ties into some of the ideological initiatives that we've talked about so far in political behavior. We have two schools of thought when it comes to economic policy. The first one is classical, the idea of laissez-faire. Government should leave the economy alone, let the economy do its thing, and just kind of take a step back. Now, Herbert Hoover tried this. It didn't work out so well for him in 1929, in 1930, in 1931, even into 1932. And more people were looking at classical economic policy and saying, this isn't working. It's not working. Classical laissez-faire is killing us. Yeah, the economy may self-correct eventually, but will we live to tell the story of what it was like? How will we feed our family in the meantime? And this led and gave rise to John Maynard Keynes, the idea of Keynesian, think of it like a candy cane, Keynesian economic thought. And this is the idea that government should step in and spend money to grow the economy out of a recession, to spend money in a way that is going to encourage growth and get people back on their feet. Then in better times, cut back on that spending, raise taxes, cut back on those things in better times and to save for a rainy day. That's the part that most people don't want to do, right? Is the tough part. And so it's always great for politicians, elected officials to step in and say, hey, we want to improve government spending and cut taxes. Well, who doesn't, right? Everybody wants to do that. But again, in order to balance your budget, you can't increase spending and cut taxes and make all of this work. And so in better times, Keynes was saying that you had to cut back on spending and you had to raise taxes in order to save for the rainy day. And then in recessionary times, spend more, cut taxes, spend more in terms of government getting money out there into the economy, encouraging that type of growth. So that's very Keynesian in terms of that economic theory. Very heavy government involvement in recessionary times in order to help grow the economy back to its full potential. So that's kind of the difference there between classical and Keynesian in terms of that approach. Now, Reaganomics, famous by Ronald Reagan, looked at this idea of monetarism or supply-side tax cuts. This was the idea of kind of combining this idea of Keynesian thought with classical theory. He basically said, well, in terms of Keynesian policy, we're going to spend it, but we're going to spend it in particular areas. We're going to go into deficits, but we're going to do it in a way that is going to help grow our economy. And we're going to cut areas where we're not going to see growth. So a lot of domestic programs got cut under Reaganomics. A lot of military programs saw an increase, a significant increase in spending. They did. There were some taxes that were cut. There were some taxes that were increased. So there was kind of a lot of trade-offs there in terms of. A lot of times conservatives don't like to hear that Reagan raised taxes. Again, Reagan was dealing with a Democratic Congress when he was negotiating and trying to figure out. There were tax cuts he did approve. He did sign into law as part of that. People don't like to talk about that, but that was part of Reaganomics. But it was also in order to get a lot of these defense spending measures and military spending to compete in the Cold War with the Soviet Union at the time. And so he was trying to grow the economy in these particular areas of defense spending, defense contractors, creating jobs in those areas, but then cutting back in more domestic ones. Where it didn't have as much of an impact, according to him. So that was what we saw with Reaganomics, was kind of a pick and choose Keynesian economic theory. Meanwhile, cutting other programs and kind of letting them kind of do their thing. And that's what we see in the Reaganomics approach. So kind of a combination of them, of Keynesian and classical in various aspects, an a la carte program of that, if you will. Some other policy goals. Again, obviously, you want to promote long-term growth. You want to be able to be competitive and have free markets that businesses can compete, but you want to also have promote employment. You also want to promote employment. And so this is where we get into things like protectionism and free trade, the importance of jobs being here at home versus going overseas. And there's a lot of back and forth on this. We see a lot of protectionist measures. President Trump was big on this. Bernie Sanders is big on this in terms of trying to create jobs in the United States and not send them abroad and trying to address that. We've also heard from free traders that argue that the standard of living actually goes up when we engage in and promote free trade. We have a lot more people that are able to benefit from free trade, and so you may not get that same job you got under protectionism. You're going to get a better job, a higher end job, and the rising tide is going to lift all boats, and that really is the driver among that free trade approach in terms of overall growth, not just growth in the same old manufacturing jobs that you had before. So we see that time and again. Some organizations and agreements that you will need to know along the way. The WTO is the World Trade Organization. They don't have a lot of teeth in the trade agreements that they're trying to enforce. It really is hard to do that when somebody breaks a trade agreement. And there's a lot more. There's a lot more sway when countries are dealing bilaterally, one-on-one, with trade agreements they're trying to enforce than multilateral negotiations when multiple countries are trying to negotiate a trade agreement altogether. It's harder to enforce that. And GATT is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This is what is basically agreed to by most nations, and the WTO is trying to enforce that. Again, not a lot of teeth. So what can you do? The answer is nothing. And that leads to things like we saw with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. NAFTA, USMECA is the new form for NAFTA. NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's now USMECA, which is the U.S., Mexico, Canada agreement that we see there. And that was removing essentially as many barriers as possible to trade between the three countries. We saw the Trans-Pacific Partnership happening in terms of doing that with the East Asian nations, in terms of trying to address that, and that was the one that President Trump pulled out of. in terms of the negotiations that were going on at the time. So these do have a significant impact on economic policy in terms of if somebody is not abiding by the trade agreement, that could negatively impact jobs here at home. That's important. The agreements that are being made along the way can impact jobs here at home, which is why we would rather be a part of those negotiations and not get everything we want, but at least get something, than not to be a part of those negotiations at all and be left with an agreement in which countries are kind of doing their own thing and they don't really care about what opinion we have because we weren't at the table. So that is where the State Department does a lot of work with the U.S. Trade Representative in terms of trying to address these types of agreements and all of it trying to promote employment, trying to promote jobs here at home. Now, there's a number of ways that we've seen government get involved in terms of regulating corporations. I won't go into a ton of detail here, but only to say there's lots of ways. Most of the time, when we see a regulation of business, it is to safeguard consumers, those that are buying products from these companies, making sure that they're safe, making sure that they're sound, making sure that they're the product as advertised. As well as the workers, to make sure that the workers are protected. They're in safe environments, that there's worker rights in terms of what's going on there. So all of the regulations we see of corporations, of businesses, of big business is really related to this type of trying to protect consumers and protect workers along the way. And that is going back to the free market model we talked about at the very beginning in terms of the importance of those regulations to keep people safe. Some other aspects in terms of regulating, we've seen the EPA created, the Environmental Protection Agency. This was through the Nixon administration. We also saw Clean Air and Clean Water Acts that were passed during that time. Environmental impact statements. All of these are regulating business, but doing it from a safety point of view. Now, we've seen some of these dialed back. We see some of these have been dialed back over the years in terms of, and there really is a pendulum. It really is a back and forth. One administration comes in and rolls back the regulation. Another administration comes in and rolls it out again, or even further. And so we see that kind of that back and forth in terms of what's going on there. Stocks also regulated again to try and keep investors safe. We see this time and again. But the government has continued over the last 30, 40, 50 years, really tried to move towards deregulation. And again, it's a pendulum back and forth. It hasn't been a constant form of deregulation, but we have seen deregulation happen over time. We saw this in the 1970s with airlines. We saw this in the 1980s with banks. We saw this in the 1990s with tech and businesses around technological innovation, and we saw this with the housing market in the early 2000s, and all of these. There's an ebb and flow, and sometimes it's healthy, and sometimes it leads to problems, and then the government has to step in and regulate it once again. So there is a back and forth in terms of what we see there, but that is important in terms of addressing why government gets involved in the first place in economic policy. Some ideological perspectives on economic policy from a liberal point of view. Again, increasing government regulation of the marketplace. They see tax the rich, spend government programs for the poor, improve those programs, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. We're seeing these as, again, very liberal economic ideologies. Again, government is there to provide a safety net, make sure that is safe and paid for. How do you do that? By taxing the rich. And we've heard that with the latest infrastructure bill, raising taxes on those making $400,000 and more. That's very much a liberal economic ideology that we see there. That would not be a conservative one. Conservative ideology would say lower taxes for middle class or higher income individuals. If you lower the taxes on higher income, the argument is It's going to encourage them to invest more in their businesses, invest more in hiring. It's going to create jobs, and that really is the argument that's being made there. It does create some jobs. The jury's out in terms of data, in terms of does it create as many jobs as the government spending would in other capacities by taxing the rich in doing so. There's a back and forth from economists on that. I always say ask 10 economists a question about economic ideology, you get 20 different answers because they will never agree on all of those things. But the idea here is that the conservative approach is really laissez-faire, is really to kind of get government out of the way, deregulate, place fewer regulations in business, in corporations, get government out of the idea of spending for social and economic equity, and really kind of get government out of the picture entirely. And that also includes a lot of those economic equity programs we talked about earlier. The idea of helping to level the playing field, they see that as government overreach in terms of a true pure conservative economic ideologue would look at it in that capacity. And then libertarian, again, they want government out of everything. So they minimize taxes entirely, get rid of regulation almost entirely, get rid of almost all government spending, and then really just focus on protecting property and protecting individual those liberties, those freedoms that we talked about before. So really a combination of what we see here from liberal and conservative viewpoints. Keynesian economics, the idea of spending when times are bad, cutting taxes and spending more money in order to encourage growth, and then cutting back on those spending programs when times are good, raising taxes when times are good in order to save for a rainy day. And that really is the Keynesian approach in terms of what we see there. Supply side economics, again, stimulate the economy by deregulating, cut taxes on businesses and allow them to take that money and spend it on hiring and creating new jobs within their industries. That's really a supply side approach. And then when we get to Keynesian and supply side, we see that in looking at this, they're all about economic growth. They're not focused on budget deficits. They're focused on getting government to take an active role in the economy, but to do so in a way very different in terms of their approaches. Keynesian would say government spending. Supply side would say get government out of the way. If you're going to spend to encourage businesses to hire more people and to grow the economy, and that's where the spending should go. So again, we see that time and again. Not always going to agree on where that spending should go, but we definitely see that overall. And then the last one to end with, don't forget about the bird policy of monetary policy. This is the idea of buy to grow, sell to slow, lower interest rates to grow the economy, raise the rates to slow the economy down, and that goes for reserve requirements and discount rates as well. Lower them to grow the economy, low to grow, raise to slow. And that is economic policy. I hope you found this helpful, and hope you find it helpful on the upcoming assessment, quiz, test, or the AP exam. We will see you in the next chapter on political parties.